Welcome back to another edition of 7 and 7. We will explore this week's Torah portion, which consists of 7 readings in just about 7 minutes. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Noach, which is the story of Noah and the flood. And famously, God tells Noah that the people of his generation have become corrupted, and that he wants to destroy them, and he's only going to save Noah and his wife and their children, their 3 sons and 3 daughters-in-law. And God specifies for Noah what type of ark, what type of ship he should build for himself, and God tells him to bring in 7 sets of kosher animals and 2 sets of non-kosher animals, and to bring all the food that is needed for everybody on that trip. And God also gives Noah specific dimensions of how he should build the ark. The Zohar points out that Noah and Abraham are often contrasted. Abraham also lived at a time of great corruption, famously the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And yet we see that when Abraham was told that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah would be punished, he negotiated with God, he begged on their behalf, he pleaded with God, and he prayed for their survival. Noah, on the other hand, there's no mention of him praying for them. And so it turns out the difference between Abraham and Noah is that both of them were told that their generations were corrupted, and that they themselves would not be punished due to their righteousness, but they had different reactions. Abraham prayed, and Noah, it seems, the Zohar points out, was just happy with the fact that he survived. And this is a powerful lesson with how we go about challenges or the various difficulties that we see other people having. Do we think to ourselves, well, I'm lucky and I'm glad that it's not me? Or do we say that's a horrible thing and I really want to pray and see how much I can help them? And both of those are 2 common approaches, but hopefully we can take the approach from Abraham rather than that of Noah. The second reading tells us that Noah collected all the species that God told him, and he brings everybody into the ark, and they lock the ark just as the flood is about to start. The word ark in the Hebrew, the Torah says, is the word teva, and the Hasidic masters, the Baal Shem Tov, teaches that the word teva in Hebrew also means a word. And so when Noah is told, Bo el teva, come into the word, it can be read, and that means that refers to the word of prayer and the word of Torah learning. And even when outside of the world around us is storming and it's raging with all kinds of challenges, we can always remember that we can find comfort and safety in the teva, in the word of Torah and in the words of prayer. The third reading tells us the details of the flood. First, there were torrential rains for 40 days and 40 nights. The water covered even the highest mountains, decimating all of humanity and all animals and living things. Then the Torah tells us that the rains continued, the water continued moving around for about 150 days. Eventually the water started going downwards and the ark settled on a mountain. And Noah realized that it might be the time for leaving the ark might be coming. He sends out a raven to find out for him if the earth is dried, if it's ready to be inhabited, and the raven fails at its mission. He then sends the dove once, twice, and on the 3rd time the dove comes back with an olive branch, and eventually they realize that the earth is drying. And finally, 1 year and 10 days after they entered the ark, on the 27th of the month of Cheshvan, the earth has dried. Now, in the next reading, we're going to see that Noah will only leave the ark once God instructs him to do that. And so commentaries discuss this idea of sending out the raven, because ultimately, if he's going to listen to God's instructions, what's really the purpose of sending out a raven to find out if the earth is dry, if he won't leave anyway without God explicitly telling him to? But really, this is the story of us as a people, and us as individuals, and that we always know and we trust that God will tell us, and God will let us know when things are right, and ultimately will help us be successful. But on the other hand, we need to do our part to try to get there. And so no one knew that he wouldn't leave without God telling him to, but he wanted to move it along with his own actions, not just rely purely on God. And so he sent out that raven. And that's a powerful lesson, that while we should trust in God, we do trust in God, but we know that ultimately we also need to be doing our own part. The 4th reading tells us that God commands Noah to leave the ark, Tzeh min hateva, to go out of the ark, together with all the other people that were with him, the animals and his family, and life is supposed to resume to normal. Noah builds an altar and he brings sacrifices to God, which pleases God, and God tells Noah that from now on the world will go back to regular, there'll be normal seasons, and there will be normal behavior in the world, different, of course, than how the world looked during the flood. God blesses Noah and his children and tells them to be fruitful and multiply, and he permits them to eat animals, which had been prohibited till then. And they can sacrifice it and eat animals, but they can't eat blood. And God tells them that murder is forbidden. The Hasidic masters point out that the words to leave the ark, tzei min ha'teva, is also a mitzvah. So just like it's a mitzvah to find comfort, to find safety in the words of Torah, as we discussed earlier, it's also a mitzvah to go out of those words, to go out into the world and make sure that we make an impact. We don't forget about the rest of the world around us, and we remember to inspire and to touch the lives of those around us by going out of the ark, by going out of our safety, and going out and to inspire other people around us. In the fifth reading, God tells us that He promises never to destroy the world through a flood again, and the rainbow is going to serve as that sign. And whenever God will bring the rainbow, that'll be a way of reminding Him not to destroy the world through water. There's a lot of conversation what the idea of the rainbow is supposed to symbolize. After all, it's not so clear in the Torah why it is the rainbow that was chosen for that purpose. But I read an interesting comment that suggests that usually rainbows come after a thunderstorm or after a lot of rain. And that's sort of the end of where the rain kind of stops and the sun comes out. And perhaps the rainbow is supposed to symbolize to Noah that after all chaos, after all storms, ultimately it's the storm before the calm. That ultimately this is really just a passing phase, and we're going to get to nice, normal, relaxed, and comfortable living. And that's what the rainbow is supposed to symbolize, to remind us that every time that there's chaos, every time that there's confusion, the world is storming around us, so to speak, we should remember that there's a rainbow. There's always going to be the calm that comes after, and we can always count on that, no matter how challenging things can be. The sixth reading tells us the story of Noah planting a vineyard, making wine out of those grapes and becoming completely drunk, and eventually falling asleep naked. His middle son Ham sees this and assaults his father, and then he reports to his brothers Shem and Yafet regarding what happened. Shem and Yafet walk in, and they're careful not to look at their father's nakedness by walking backwards. The Torah tells us twice that's what they did, and they cover him. And then when Noah wakes up and he finds out, and he curses his son Ham. Then the Torah tells us a whole long list of nations and people that came out of the children of Noah. It's a total list of 70 names, and this is the basis for the idea in Judaism that there are 70 nations, or 70 primary nations, which we bring sacrifices for on Sukkot. As you may remember, and this idea comes up in many other places, and it's in this week's Torah portion where the 70 names are mentioned. The Rebbe points out that the Torah is clear to tell us that Shem and Yafet did not see their father's nakedness. The Torah, in fact, repeats it multiple times that they walked backwards and they didn't see it, etc. And the Rebbe points out that there's a deeper message here. Not only did they not see it, but they also didn't hold him accountable for it. They didn't see the guilt either. And so sometimes we see somebody is doing something wrong, and we try to fix it, but we ultimately view them as someone lesser, someone who fell through the challenge, someone who was doing something wrong. Shem and Yafet here are teaching us that it's ultimately a lot of it is in our own perception. And if we're seeing someone else doing something wrong, perhaps it's really our perception. Whereas Shem and Yafet, not only did they not see the actual issue because they made sure not to look, they turned around, but they didn't even see the idea of it. They couldn't even think of their father as being somewhat guilty, and the only thing they were able to think of was how can they go about best repairing this. And that's a powerful lesson. The next time you see somebody doing something questionable, ask yourself, what are you really seeing? Maybe you're really seeing yourself in them, and that's why you're rushing to view the things in the way that you are. The seventh and final reading tells us a fascinating story of the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babylonia, where the people, ultimately all Noah's descendants, came together and decided that they would build a tower to make for themselves a name. And of course, the well-known interpretation that they intended to fight God, and God disrupts that by dispersing the people, each one learning a different language, so they no longer can communicate. The Torah then goes back to telling us about the descendants of Shem, and the Torah lists a whole bunch of generations, ultimately ending with the story of Avraham and his wife Sarah, also known then as Avram and Sarai, who were born, and Avram and Sarai are descendants of Shem. The Midrash points out that the idea that the people of the Tower of Bavel were only punished mildly, whereas the people of Noah's generation were obviously punished severely, although the people of Bavel were fighting with God. The reason why they were punished only so mildly was because they loved each other. They were working together towards this common goal, although of course a bad one, but nonetheless the Midrash points out that here's the power of love, whereas the people in the generation of Noah were occupied with fighting with one another and stealing from one another, which of course is not against God, but it's against one another, and that's why the punishment was so severe. The Midrash says that from here we learn the power of peace. L'chaim, may we all merit ultimate peace with the coming of Mashiach. Shabbat shalom and have a great week.